Hello everybody! The labor theory of value is a core part of why Marxists believe that capitalism is inherently exploitative. So, naturally, all the brave defenders of capitalism try their best to debunk it. Unfortunately, they're never really good at it. So today I will attempt to, in good faith and with an open mind, look at their arguments, think about them, and explain why they're all wrong and I'm right. But before we begin, let's recap the labor theory of value for those in the back who weren't listening. Skip this if you think you know everything already. Basically, it's a theory which tries to explain why things cost what they cost. In other words, what's their value. And the labor theory of value puts forward the idea that everything gets its value from the labor that was put into it. The classical Marxist example is linen, but it's 2020, so let's use a phone. This is a bunch of parts a phone is made up of. It's a screen, a camera, a battery, a case, and so on. And if we assemble those, the resulting product will always have a higher value than the individual parts put together. This is because it consists of the parts plus the labor of assembling them. And the more labor it takes, the more valuable it is. Assembling a phone might only take a few minutes and would thus not add that much value to the product. But assembling a handcrafted wooden table takes a lot more labor, so the value of the table is way higher than the value of the raw materials. And if we look close enough, everything is just made up of labor. Those raw materials as well. The battery was assembled by someone, and the lithium was mined by someone, and crucially, from that it follows that natural resources don't have an inherent value. Yes, diamonds are very expensive and have a high value, but according to the labor theory of value, you're not paying for the inherent value of a diamond. After all, it's just a rock. What you are paying for is all the labor that went into getting it to you. The labor of the person who located the diamond mines, the one who dug up the diamonds, the labor of the person who analyzed its quality, the labor of the person who transported it to you, the labor of the salesperson who tries to convince you to buy this one instead of the less expensive one. All of that labor, which is quite a lot, is why diamonds are expensive and sand isn't. Sand is so common that all it takes to get a kilo is a shovel and 20 seconds. Diamonds are rarer, so they need a lot more labor to collect. And from this theory it also follows that since all value ultimately comes from labor, if someone makes money without labor, where does that come from? And the answer is pretty simple. For every dollar someone made without working, someone worked without earning a dollar. There are two ways to make money without doing work. Either be a landlord and demand people pay rent, or be an employer. And the way employers make money is simply by underpaying workers. Let's have a look at this example. These are our raw material and upkeep costs. This is the value of the finished product. And using very basic maths, we can see that our worker provided labor of this value. But now the employer can't make a profit that way, so they pay the worker less. This arrangement in which an employer pays an employee a wage is called wage labor, by the way. And this bit of labor, which the employee worked for, but which they weren't paid for and which the employer took, is called surplus labor or surplus value. And that's why in Marxism, both rent keeping and wage labor are seen as immoral and exploitative. Obviously there's more to it, like 3 books worth, but we're gonna start watching some critiques now. Originally I was gonna go through one video after another explaining the misunderstandings that came up, but it's always the same 5 arguments, though props to these 3 for making up their own ones in addition to repeating the same 5 from the others. So let's get started. I've arbitrarily decided to start with the more silly ones and end with the most credible arguments. So first of all, we'll address the argument that there are possible scenarios in which nobody is exploited. This is brought forth by Shane Killian. Remember the ANCAP who refused to watch the video I made about him? His video starts off by saying that exploited doesn't mean anything by using the wrong definition. He says exploiting just means to make use of something, and that's true. But Shane, please look at the second definition. Yeah, that's what they mean. Anyway, he names an example of a business named Alice's Widgets. Only Alice works there, so no exploitation. That's how she makes her money. As you can see, she makes most money doing executive tasks and only a little by doing other tasks. So she hires 4 employees so she can do her executive tasks all week long. She also pays all workers the value they produce, so there is no exploitation. And that's nice and all, But Shane does nothing to show how this maps onto reality. He's just making up a scenario in which the thing we're talking about isn't happening. The problem is that this doesn't mean it's not happening. Sure, in this made-up example nobody is exploited, but that doesn't mean it happens in reality. After all, Alice would be making more money if she just paid Bob minimum wage instead of $3,000 a month. And if Bob disagreed, she could hire another person. So, to use neoliberal terminology, there is a financial incentive for Alice to pay the workers less. Sure, it's possible that 100% of her profit is generated by her own labor, and that any labor done by someone else is fairly compensated for. It's just disincentivized. And moreover, this explanation might be possible to be used in a small-scale business in which the employer is very hands-on and works a lot. But once you scale it up, it becomes increasingly unlikely. Do we really think that Jeff Bezos does so much work himself that he generates $2,500 every second, even while he's sleeping? I don't think that that's realistic. I think a part, and probably a very big part, of his fortune comes from having workers pack stuff in warehouses and then paying them ever so slightly less than what their labor is actually worth. And if you aren't convinced by that example, let's use this one. Investors. They own stock and get paid dividends. But they don't labor for those dividends, so they have to be taken from someone who did. And that's exploitation. So I'm sorry, Shane, just because there is one theoretical example in which exploitation doesn't happen, doesn't mean reality reflects that. The next criticism is made by the Ayn Rand Institute. Yeah, the real one.
The real source of value is the human mind. The real source of value is the reasoning individual. It's the person who's thinking, the person who's discovering, is the person who's observing and integrating the facts of reality constantly. So it's the intellect that is the source of all value. Physical labor is just one small manifestation of it.
So basically, Marx is wrong because lots of value is generated by non-physical tasks. And I think this is a linguistic problem, perhaps a bad translation, because against what this man in his black void will tell you, Marx did also consider intellectual work to be labor. So yeah, to say the labor theory of value is wrong because of non-physical labor is wrong because it considers that. And honestly, that's something I'd expect that guy to know. If this was made by some ANCAP in a garage, that would be one thing. But this was uploaded by the official YouTube channel of the Ayn Rand Institute. These guys made a profit of $3 million in 2018. And you want to tell me they couldn't find someone who actually read Das Kapital to appear in their video? How can that be? How can such a big organization not have one person who knows about that? I can tell you how. Anyone who read Das Kapital wouldn't be the kind of person to work with the Ayn Rand Institute. The same way that no libertarian understands socialism, because if they understood it, they would not be libertarians. So that argument is a bust because the labor theory of value does not only mean physical labor in the same way an English speaker may assume, but all work which generates value. The next one is made by a lovely person called Matty's Modern Life. They go over the basics of what the labor theory of value is and so on, and then they drop this very interesting assertion.
Let's take the example I used before. The owner sells the widget for $100. He pays his worker $50 to make it and for $20 of raw materials. The gross profit stands at $30. What the labour theory of value fails to take into account is that out of this $30, the entrepreneur has to pay maintenance on his factory. He has to liaise with customers and set up contracts. He may have to make loan repayments.
Alright, so the argument is the employer taking value from employees is justified because of upkeep costs. To correct this graphic, by the way, he failed to show that the labor of the employee has a value of 80 while being paid 50. But I suppose, honestly, depicting the labor theory of value wouldn't work if you plan on misrepresenting it like that. Just to address this, the upkeep and loan payments and so on are all counted in here, in the raw materials part. So the labor theory of value does consider upkeep costs. So that point was wrong as well. Those were all the arguments which were unique. As you can tell, they were rather weak ones. From now on, all these arguments were used by different people at once, so we'll spend more time on those. The next point is made by Back Alley, spelled as one word, philosophy, and by our favorite magic spell, Ben Shapiro. Let's see what the spelling mistake has to say first.
If a handicapped person were to, in 6 hours, produce the same output as a regular person could in 1 hour, according to the labor theory of value, the product produced by the handicapped person would be artificially made more valuable simply because it was made by a handicapped person and it took more time to create it.
There we have it. The theory that value comes from labor can't be true because we all labor at different speeds. Marx noticed that, believe it or not. So when Marxists say labor, what they really mean is socially necessary labor time, which, as you can imagine, is the average time it takes to do that work. So when Marxists say a table takes an hour to produce, they mean that it takes that long on average. The value only changes as the average labor time changes. So for example, if a new tool is invented that helps you assemble phones more quickly, then that makes the value of phones go down. And if you want to look at it through a neoliberal lens, it holds up as well. As you can produce more products with the same labor costs, the price will decrease as the supply increases. You know, supply and demand, the thing liberals pretend I don't understand. Besides this faulty argument, Back Alley's video is very impressive for using all 5 generic arguments at once. No other video here does that, so we'll hear more from them in a bit. Let's now turn to Ben Shapiro for another instance of the not all labor is equally valuable argument.
The labor theory of value, which is that the amount of work you put into something dictates the value of the thing, is a bunch of crap. If I spend all day making mud pies outside, that's an awful lot of work. It's also completely useless. The way that you actually determine the value of work is by trading it for somebody else's work in a fully voluntary fashion.
Thank you, Ben. Now, the second part of this was that the way value should be determined is by trade. But let's ignore that statement for a bit. We will get back to it when we talk about the argument that value is subjective. I am interested in the first part of the argument here. He says that making mud pies is a lot of work, but also worthless, and that therefore the labor theory of value is wrong. And if I may say so, this is a classical Shapiro argument. It's a correct conclusion built on wrong pretenses. You see, Ben is changing what the labor theory of value is. If you recall, I described it as a theory which says that everything gets its value from the labor that was put into it. Ben hears that and then assumes that it works the other way around as well. He assumes that if value comes from labor, then that means that labor is valuable. So if he defeats that idea, the whole thing would be wrong. The problem is that that underlying assumption is wrong. Just because all value comes from labor doesn't mean all work is valuable. Nobody I've ever met or read from said that all labor is valuable. So we agree on this. Making mud pies is worthless. But to me that has nothing to do with the labor theory of value. But to Ben it seems to be related, so why is that? How did Ben come to assume wrong, and how can we explain the labor theory of value better in the future so misunderstandings like that won't happen anymore? I can't tell you because I haven't spoken to Ben about this, so I'll guess. I think he heard that the labor theory of value says that value comes from work, and from that he assumed that work must have intrinsic value. So I suppose if you're explaining the labor theory of value, make sure to mention that. Remind the person you're talking to that yes, a thing is only worth as much because someone invested labor into it. After all, if nobody worked it, it wouldn't change and does not increase in value. But no, that does not mean that all work is valuable or even equally valuable. There are useless jobs after all, like making mud pies or being an investment banker. In case you're wondering about the mud pie example in the labor theory of value, here you go. The mud has a value of 2 cents, and after the process, the mud pies have a value of about 2 cents. So the labor was completely useless according to the labor theory of value itself. The next one is the only argument which I had genuinely never heard about before. It requires the concept of future money to work, so let's listen to our friend Back Alley Productions, one word, explain it. He asks why the traditional business model is desirable and not exploitative, and explains that
Let's say I were to ask you to lend me $1,000, and you did. And I said that I would pay you back the same amount of money in 1 year's time. Even if you completely trusted me, you would not do this. You wouldn't give me that $1,000 because you value that $1,000 now, and you'd be giving up the satisfaction of having that $1,000 now by giving it up to me.
you may be wondering what they are trying to say, and it's basically that when given the choice between having money now and having money in the future, people want the money now. the money now is called present money, and the money you'll have later is called future money.
So, if I offered you 2,000 future dollars for $1,000 today, you are not exploiting me by taking my $2,000 for your $1,000 in present money, and that is the voluntary aspect of the association aside.
So ignore the word per, whatever that's supposed to mean.
For your
From now on, I will assume he's trying to say per year, or maybe for your, or per year. I've made a community post and we have not been able to figure it out. Luckily, language has lots of redundancies, so we can still understand what he's trying to say. So the argument is, if he offers you $2,000 of future money and you give him $1,000 now, that's not exploitation. And in case you're still wondering what that's supposed to represent, he's the employee there. The deal goes, the employee gives $2,000 worth of labor to the employer over the next period of time, and in exchange the employer gives them $1,000. Of course, there are problems with that. For one, that's not how capitalism works. Generally, wage laborers are not paid in advance. They work for a month and are then paid after that month. So it's more like the employee gives $2,000 to the employer in present money and is given $1,000 in future money. That sounds like an even worse deal than the one I suggested in the beginning. But to be honest, I'm not even sure if back alley philosophy even tries to say that, because their video is staggeringly incoherent. It probably doesn't come across as such because I try my best to edit the inconsistencies out and explain everything they fail to explain, but it's very hard to follow and doesn't really make a lot of sense. That's what I would call bad argumentation. Feel free to watch it, link in the description. But either I just debunk their argument by mentioning that that's not how workers are paid, or their argument is completely incoherent and incomprehensible. Either way, I think I won. But luckily for capitalism, I found another person using the exact same argument, even with the same concepts of future money and the exact same example of a loan which we supposedly won't give out because present money is better than future money, apparently.
I know that I can produce a certain number of automobiles that will yield me $1 million 1 year from now. Would I be willing to pay the workers, and let's forget about the raw materials and so on, let's just assume the workers are, would I be willing to pay the workers the full $1 million? Well, of course not. Okay, no one else would.
That's an interesting one. He says he wouldn't pay the workers for the profit they produce, and no one else would. I have doubts that this is true, but a Marxist might say that just because you would act like the capitalist does not mean that the capitalist is acting correctly. The reason capitalism is problematic is because it puts people into positions in which treating others unfairly is the best thing to do. But that can't be justified by saying that anyone would do it. That doesn't make it right. That just shows that the problem is bigger than individual choice. The problem isn't that the capitalists are greedy, the problem is that people are put into positions in which being greedy is financially rewarded. But sorry, I interrupted, he wasn't done yet. He then explains time preference. He says that time preference is how much more people value future stuff over present stuff. For example, 10% time preference over 1 year would mean that money now is 10% more valuable than money a year from now.
So if there was about a 10% time preference on average in society, the total amount of wages paid to workers would be 10% less than $1 million. That is about $900,000.
So the logic here is that the capitalist is paying the workers $900,000 and in return gets $1 million. But that's totally not exploitation because in our example, the workers are all paid up front and the money all comes at the end of the process for some reason. So presumably those 900,000 are equal to the 1 million because of time preference. After all, 1 million in the future are 10% less valuable, which means that both the employer and the employees got a fair deal, assuming you believe in time preference. Ignoring the fact that that's not how cash flow in the average corporation works, it's also not how wages work. Employers don't look at an analysis of time preference and offer a deal to the workers which seems fair. The employer suggests a deal which is best for them, and the employee either agrees to it or gets fired. To suggest that it's fine that the employer gets a bigger part because they get the money later doesn't hold water. And even if it did, what does that change? Can I just tell my employer that I have a time preference of 0% and would value $1 million in 1 year over $900,000 now? No, I can't. That's because the preference is not a factor which is actually considered with wage labor. And again, that's not how capital flows anyway. Usually the capitalist gets paid all throughout the month as shipments go out and customers buy stuff, and the workers are paid at the end of the month, after having worked. That means if we want to assume that time preference is a valid concept, which I don't by the way, but if we agree that it's a valid concept, even then we can't turn it around. The workers are investing their current money in the form of labor for an entire month in exchange for future money. So if the capitalists want to make it fair, they would have to offer more than the value of the labor. If a worker agreed to deliver $2,000 of labor now, then they should be given more than $2,000 at the end. Not less, because the future 2,000 are less valuable than the current 2,000. But the way it works in reality is that the employer pays the worker 1,000. So something is not adding up here. And I genuinely believe that using the concept of free money is a very weak argument and borderline ridiculous. But this one goes hand in hand with the next argument, which is that the employers deserve to get money because they invested their money into the business. This argument is made by 5 out of the 8 videos I watched. Let's watch a few of those. First by our friend with the future money.
At some point in the past, that person who has become the capitalist was a saver first, was someone who abstained from consumption, and may not have been even particularly rich, but abstained from consumption in the present and accumulated a certain capital.
Then by Ben Shapiro, he's talking about worker co-ops in the beginning.
I am a worker at my company. I own my business with another person who owns the company with me, and a couple of investors. The investors have sunk their labor, which they made money from, right? Money is just a tangible trade for labor, and they took that money and they invested it in us.
So he seems to be saying that the investors should own part of the company and profits because they invested money. If you disagree with my interpretation, that's fine. The next one to make that argument is a person called Libertarian Rants. Another one of the reasonable people who are so open to changing their mind that they put their current ideology into their username. He starts off saying that even if the labor theory of value is correct, his argument would still stand strong against it. He goes into an example of a man named Jake, who makes his own company selling space heaters and employs one laborer.
Now Jake sells those space heaters for $50 each, and let's say the laborer can produce 1 space heater an hour. To say that Jake is exploiting the laborer because he only pays them $40 an hour is to completely ignore half of a lifespan of colossal amounts of time, mental energy, physical energy, resources, and money that Jake had invested into that business years before that laborer had ever even heard of his business.
Back alley philosophy also makes the same argument that the capitalist invested, and so does Matty's Modern Life. You know, the one who didn't know that upkeep costs are part of raw materials. So all of these people, minus maybe Ben Shapiro, depending on how you want to interpret his words, are saying that the employer deserves compensation for their investment. And honestly, I see where you're coming from. Starting a business is a tremendous personal and financial risk, especially in our late-stage capitalist economy in which every niche already has a monopoly or oligopoly. I wouldn't be brave enough to start a restaurant next to McDonald's, and I admire those that do, especially since risking that means also risking financial ruin, which also means becoming homeless because we have not yet abolished landlords. But I still don't think it's just that they take the value of the employees. Think about it. The argument would be that the employer deserves a cut of the money produced by the employee because they spent money before. So someone else gets to take my money just because they already have lots of money to invest into a business. I am sorry to say this, but I don't think I should have to give my value to someone else because they already have money. This is a moral argument, by the way. It depends on whether you feel like the employer risking their money justifies getting payment, and that payment should be taken from employees without their consent. And yes, it's without consent. I was never asked if I wanted to give part of my money to my boss because they invested lots of money so they could hire me. And I genuinely think that if I was given that option, I would at least think about it. because I do agree with the first half of the statement. I do think that it's fair to compensate people who invested their money, but I don't think that they have a right to take minus compensation. Like, I also think that we should help the poor, and I am willing to donate to charities to help them, but I would not be alright with the poor taking an undisclosed part of my income without asking me. That would be theft. And the employer keeping a part of my money because they feel entitled to it is only marginally different. So yes, in general I think that it would be fair for people to be compensated for such risk. I just don't think that that compensation should be taken from others without consent. So now I've addressed this one. I've explained that I morally agree that employers invested, but I disagree that they deserve the labor of the workers for it. There are many ways this apparent contradiction can be solved, but that's not the point of this video. The point is, this argument falls flat because having invested money doesn't mean you're entitled to the value of others. The next one is the second most common, right after the one that says that capitalists deserve compensation. It says that wage labor can't be exploiting because it's voluntary, or alternatively, that we can't do anything besides wage labor because that wouldn't be voluntary. Since they have the same premise, that wage labor is voluntary, I will treat them as the same argument here. It's featured so many times that I don't really see the need to find a clip of someone making that argument. Like, if I said that libertarians say wage labor is voluntary, then nobody's going to accuse me of strawmanning them, right? Because voluntary contracts are like their whole thing. The argument goes that free market capitalism isn't a bad system as such, because it's not like the government will come and throw you in jail if you don't work. Unlike in evil Stalinist countries like Norway, in which doctors are forced to treat people even if they don't want to. That sounds a bit ridiculous, because it is. I believe that's an argument Ben Shapiro made once. It went something like, if you declare healthcare a right, then that means the government has to force people to become doctors. I have to admit, I was not able to find the clip, but I did remember where I heard about it. It was an example in this book about basic argumentation. By the way, I give it a 4 out of 5. It goes over the details very well and helps you focus on what parts of arguments are very important, and it's easy to read. Unfortunately, it isn't that good at advanced argumentation, and if you work in programming, you could probably skip half of the book since you probably already know propositional calculus, and much of the book just goes into explaining that. Anyway, I don't think I have to make an argument for why Norway isn't forcing people to become doctors at gunpoint, since nobody believes that anyway. But there are people who believe that once socialism happens, they will be forced to work or be sent to the gulag. And I could say that the socialism people are aiming for isn't really like the Stalinism of the past at all, and that it probably wouldn't even be centrally planned, and that the government might be completely detached from the economy, and that, practically speaking, there would still be companies around which you could work at voluntarily, with the only difference being that they are democratically run to give the workers a say in how their surplus value is spent. But let's ignore all of those. Let's ignore that. Let's just look at the free market. Is it really voluntary? I have a video on that topic already, but it doesn't make any argument. It just places the character that says it's voluntary in a new situation in order to recontextualize the arguments that are typically made. Then I wasn't sure how well my points would get across, so one character just outright states what everything is supposed to represent. Why do I only get a spoon? Didn't you get a shovel? What is that supposed to represent? Advantages at birth. I thought it was funny, I don't know. I thought it was lazy writing. Some people in the comment section said it was clever. Apparently the line between lazy and clever is up for debate. Anyway, the core argument was that you can look at someone applying for a job and you can call that voluntary, provided they aren't forced. But if you look at the context in which they make that decision, it's more questionable whether it's really all that voluntary. Like, obviously in Shane Killen's example, where nobody is exploited and the world outside of this one business doesn't exist, it's all free. But real life is bigger than one business and one applicant. And if we look at that context, we might see many reasons why the choice to work isn't as free as it seems at first. That applicant might need a job to pay their flat or to provide for their family. There might not be enough jobs at the time, so they might need to compete with other applicants and take a very bad deal. Killian talks about how employees can simply walk out on bad employment contracts. But that's only true if the economy is doing well. And for some unforeseen reason, unemployment has never been zero in capitalist countries. And homelessness has never been zero either, despite the fact that there are more peopleless homes than homeless people. So another way to look at it is to say that while the employer is not forcing an employee to work, the economy we live in does. So you have to ask yourself, is it really voluntary to say engage in this contract or become homeless and go hungry? I wouldn't say so, and there are people who disagree with that. There are people who are determined to blame the employees. If only you had learned a different job, if only you hadn't signed that lease, if only you moved in with your mother again. All of those are individualist solutions to systemic problems. They might work for individuals, I don't doubt that, but structurally speaking, we can't abolish homelessness while we still have a housing market. So if we keep using individualism, we'll never solve problems like those. But that's not the argument here. The argument here was that capitalism is good because wage labor is voluntary. I disagree, because it's not a choice made in a vacuum. It's a choice determined by the economic system we live in, by capitalism. So to say capitalism is good because it's voluntary means to ignore all of the involuntary choices you need to make to survive in the system. In the end, you can't choose not to live somewhere, and you can't choose not to eat. So you are forced to do everything the people with the food and housing demand. And they demand money. And the only way to get money is to engage in wage labor, or somehow summon enough money out of the ether to start your own business and exploit others. So no, not really all that voluntary if you have a look at context. The last and, in my opinion, strongest argument is value is subjective. This goes back to what the labor theory of value was originally about, before Marx got his hands on it and used it to teach gay propaganda to innocent white toddlers. It was used by Adam Smith, you know, the guy who practically invented modern capitalism. And they wanted to figure out why stuff costs what it costs. The labor theory of value says it's because of labor. Nowadays, most economists don't believe in that anymore, as the libertarians will tell you. Nowadays, we say something is worth whatever someone says it's worth, or alternatively, it's worth what two people agree it's worth. So if I want to sell a phone for $500 and you want to buy a phone for $500, then that's its value. That's the subjective theory of value. If someone else comes along and wants to buy a phone for $400 and I sell them one for $400, that one is just worth $400, even though they're the exact same otherwise. This goes for everything, not just products, stuff like housing and labor as well. There are some clips of others saying that.
The way that you actually determine the value of work is by trading it for somebody else's work in a fully voluntary fashion.
Please note that this is right after he said that money is just another form of labor. So when he says trading for someone else's work, what he means is wage labor. The next clip is by Warren Leemkuhl II, which is a very small channel, but it was among the first results which attempts to explain why the labor theory of value is wrong.
It all depends on how much that VCR is worth to you as an individual to determine value. Maybe it is worth $70 to you because you actually want and need one, because you do not have a DVR or the internet and you want a way to record TV programs. Maybe it is worth nothing to you because you have one or you do not want one.
Neat rhetorical trick here, by the way. He makes a controversial statement and pretends it's a fact, without any foundation. There is literally no argument in here. He just says it's that way. Next one is Back Alley, one word, talking about that. I told you they mention everything.
Imagine you have two people. One's living in a desert and one is living on lakefront property in some woodland area. The person who is living in the desert has very limited access to water, but has easy access to caves full of diamonds that can be mined located in the desert. The person who lives next to the lake has limited access to diamonds, yet has virtually unlimited access to water. Clearly, somebody who lives right next to a lake with no diamond mines values diamonds more than somebody who has easy access to diamond mines but limited access to water, vice versa. And that is because value is subjective.
So that's how they choose to put it. Last one's Matty's Modern Life again.
The truth is, value is subjective. What you value and what I value are often widely different, and we value different things at different times. This is the subjective theory of value. This is the idea that an object's value is not inherent, and is instead worth more to different people based on how much they desire or need the object.
So there we have it. Value isn't objective because we value different things differently. And yeah, I don't doubt that. Nobody would. No reasonable person would ever say that things have the exact same value for everyone. Why do people even listen to this Marx guy? How come it took 150 years for someone to make a YouTube video on this? It's so obvious. Socialism destroyed. Oh wait, Marx knew. It's actually a well-developed part of the labor theory of value, which he talks about in detail in Das Kapital. Now, what I'm about to say is the way Marx put it and the way orthodox Marxists like to put it. I will present this one and afterwards I will show you my own counter to this argument. I will show you how wage labor is still exploitative even if you assume that value is subjective. But now to the classical Marxist explanation. So we assume that objects have a certain value based on the amount of labor that was put into them. But in addition to that, they also have a price. Oh, what? Price? Value? Isn't that the same thing? No, not in Marxism. Value is the actual true value of a thing, and the price is what you pay. And notably, outside of theoretical examples, you will only ever encounter the price. You will never pay the value of a thing simply because nobody sells things at their value because then they couldn't profit. Value is more of a theoretical concept of how cheap a product could be. The way I usually explain it is that the value is the absolute lowest price. Imagine if a phone was made with a 0% profit margin and every single part, tool, machine and so on was produced on a 0% profit margin as well. It's the lowest the price can ever go. If I had to guess, I would say for a phone that would be $200. But the exact value doesn't matter because it doesn't occur in reality anyway. It just helps us analyze the production process. It's not meant to be the way to determine what to price things at, like Warren seems to think. And what is that price influenced by? Use value. So what is use value then? Just how much you get out of a product, like diamonds or water. And this one changes from person to person. So Marxism has subjective value. It's just not the only thing Marxism focuses on. That use value then changes the price in accordance with supply and demand. Yes, Marxism understands supply and demand. So there you have it. Marxism recognizes that products are judged differently by different people. It just thinks that there is more to it. So why didn't I tell you about price and value in the beginning? Because it's simpler. That's why I only have to talk about value and none of the other stuff. Explaining that takes time. So oftentimes, when people write a short explanation about the labor theory of value, they let out these parts, and then all these libertarians come along and assume wrong things based on their limited knowledge. Obviously, if you only heard about value, you're gonna be confused by it. And I also didn't tell you in the beginning because I thought that way I didn't spoil this part of the video and surprise you with my knowledge. Did it work? Leave a comment. Anyway, that's the Marxist explanation, but you might still have some questions about it. One possible reply would be to read Das Kapital, the first volume, but if you are the kind of person who didn't know that Marxism has 3 types of value because you only read 2-sentence summaries, then you probably aren't going to read Marx anyway. So for you, I have my own explanation which I came up with. Please note that to my knowledge, nobody ever made this argument, so it might have some flaws. If you want to destroy Marxism, please focus on the things more than one person says. That being said, here we go. Even if we assume that all value is subjective, wage labor is still exploitation. Let's have a look at our example again. We have someone making a phone and a boss. Here are the raw materials. Let's say they cost 200. And yes, they include maintenance and other running costs. Then the worker adds 300 worth of labor and gets paid 100. The boss is left with 200 in surplus value, aka profit. If we now do a subjectivism, then all of these numbers turn into question marks. After all, there is no intrinsic value and we can't possibly say what anything is priced at. We could average out the values or something like that, but let's not. Let's just freeze the production in time. Let's say at our timestamp the upkeep is still exactly 200. I am not saying it's always 200, it can be anything and it might change any second as power costs or raw materials change price. But right now it's 200. And let's say the employer still sells the product for 500. Maybe it's more sometimes and less other times depending on how supply and demand are acting, but right now it's 500. So what's the value of the labor of the worker? We can't possibly know, it's subjective after all. And we can assume that to the employer it's worth 100 because that's how much they pay the worker. And how much is it worth to the worker? Presumably 100 as well, because otherwise they wouldn't work there. They would get another job, wouldn't they? So everything is fine then. The worker and employer agree on how much the work was worth and then everyone pays or receives a fair price. And the boss is making a profit because the boss and customers are valuing the labor put into the product higher than the worker does. We know that because both the boss and the customers agree that the finished product has a value which is about 300 higher than the value of the raw materials. But wait, if the customers and boss agree that the labor increased the value by about 300, which we know because they sell/buy it for 500, why does the employee think their labor is only worth 100? Why is there this different interpretation of the value? In other words, how did the employee come to assume this? Because the employer said that the labor is worth 100. That's the offer the employer made. And the employer knew that the employee would produce more than that, otherwise they wouldn't have hired them. So the only reason the employee thought the labor had a value of 100 was because that's what they were told. And based on that, they made the choice to give away their labor of 100, even though pretty much everyone implicitly agrees it had a value of 300. They entered that contract because the employer misled them into believing that their work was only worth 100. And fun fact, a contract based on a lie is illegal and morally wrong. So even in a world in which objective value does not exist, the conclusion of the labor theory of value is still true. And the conclusion is that the employer must pay the employee less than the value of their labor. Even if that value is subjective, that has to be true, or else capitalism can't generate a profit. And yes, you will be able to make up a scenario in which exploitation doesn't happen, like Shane Gillian, and you will be able to talk about how actually brains are the source of value, and so on, but you can't refute the fact that to make a profit, a capitalist must pay the workers less than the value they generated for the employer, even if that value is relative, not because capitalists are bad people, but because we live in a bad system. Thanks for watching. My videos are ad-free thanks to my Patreons. If you're able to, why not give me a few dollars via Patreon? And if you give me $10, then I will say your name at the end of my video, like this. Special thanks to Aaron J. Patton, Dordozy, Generalist77 and Tyler Dang for your generous donations.